Yep, I believe it is Trailblazer with one S. And I would say you can correct me, but not since you are in listen only mode. So trailblazer.salesforce.com, our Trailblazer community. You will go to the community tab and you will simply click on groups. Again, you can find the admin Trailblazer group from there. So take a minute to do that if you haven't done so already, since everyone's in listen only mode for our webinar. Now, some of you may have spent some time on Trailhead Live. Trailhead Live is not a place where content is being actively added. So some of the content is a little bit older. A lot of the concepts will be there. A lot of the concepts will be the same. So if you want to do additional study, it's on demand. You can watch it in your own time. You can still check out our whole archive of videos on Trailhead Live. You'll see a lot of people from the Trailblazer community. You'll see instructors like myself, and good place to go for additional learning. Okay, I think that takes care of our housekeeping. Again, I see a few more people have joined us, so welcome. Again, my name is Caitlin Nguyen. I'm a delivery experience manager and admin instructor with Trailhead Academy. Just a reminder, everyone is in listen-only mode for this webinar. We are not permitted to record this, either audio or video. The slides will not be shared. It's just what we get in our live portion over the next few hours. So welcome, everyone. I hope you are ready for a fairly packed session with some learning. Before we actually jump into our content itself, a little bit of heads up around our schedule. So we are here together for about 5 hours. It's kind of a condensed day that we have. I will have some breaks built in. I know 5 hours is a lot of time to focus virtually. We're not going to do a full lunch break today, but I think we'll probably take about 2 15-minute breaks to break up this content. So maybe about an hour and a half in, we'll take one break, go for a little while, about another hour and a half, take another break so we can break up our time. The specific timing of those breaks will kind of depend on where we land in the content. So I don't have a specific time for those breaks, but when we're at a natural breaking point in the content, we will go ahead and take a break so we can step away for a little bit. I think that covers our housekeeping. We are going to get into our actual content, starting with a big portion of the exam, configuration and setup. Here we go. When we introduce each of these lessons, they will correspond with a portion of the exam. So from Trailhead, and I can show you all this towards the end of our session. From Trailhead, if you go to the credentials section or portion of the page, you can find the admin exam page. And you know what? Let me go ahead and show you now so you can follow along if you are interested. So if I go out to Trailhead, I should be logged in already. From Trailhead, once it loads, you should see an option under credentials to click on certifications. Credentials and certifications is where you will find the main exam page. And it defaults to the Salesforce admin role. And then for certification, I'm going to click on administrator. Again, this is our cert prep for the beginning admin, or what we call the admin exam. And this is the main exam page for that exam. We will come back to this towards the end of our session as we talk more about the exam in general. But at the top of this page is a link that says Get the Exam Guide. And it will give me general details about the exam. And if I scroll down, I'll see an exam outline. You all may have checked this out already. And what we will see on our slides at the beginning of each of our lessons are the section that it corresponds to from the exam outline. And if we expand this section, we will see the specific objectives in that portion of the exam. So this is where this information is coming from. This is the exam objective. It's configuration and setup, and it's 20% of the exam. So looks at the weighting, what portion of questions fall under this category, 20% of your questions. Pretty significant portion of the exam. This has to do with general configuration. This is also where security falls in. So let's look at the specific objectives. Describe the options found in company settings. So general settings that you initially set when you first sign your contract. What options do we have? Understand different options for admin and configuration of the user interface. Demonstrate proper setup and maintenance of users in your org. So how do you maintain users? And then explain different security controls. So this is one bullet point here. I know it talks a little bit more about security later on. In general, security is going to be a pretty big portion of the exam, and we'll spend a decent amount of time on it this morning. Given a scenario, apply the appropriate security controls based on features and capabilities of the different security features that you can apply. And a number of our objectives, you will note, start with given a scenario, based on a scenario, because some of the questions will ask you to take these concepts and apply what you know to a scenario. Not necessarily just matching a term with a definition. It's the application level of understanding that many of these questions on the exam will test for. Again, given a scenario, when do we use profiles, permission sets, and how do we use those to control access? So this is general configuration and setup, and a big portion of this is security. I apologize, some of the formatting is going to be a little bit off here, but I will read to you what it says if the font is a little bit small. And we have Rose Lucio here. She is a fictitious character. She works for a company called Northern Trail Outfitters. And you may have seen Northern Trail Outfitters in some of our other trainings or our marketing demos. It's a fictitious company that sells outdoor fitness and recreational goods. So if you're in a mare, I always think of it as similar to REI. They sell tents, they sell hiking boots. So some of the requests will come from people at this company. And who we have here is Rose Lucio, our CEO of Northern Trail Outfitters. So she's letting us know that Northern Trail Outfitters recently acquired another company called CloudKicks. And we need to set up CloudKicks in Salesforce. But before we do, we want to make sure our current company settings support their needs. So when we refer to company settings, much of this is found in a section in setup called the company profile. And a lot of this information is captured when you first sign a contract with Salesforce. So if you are working with an existing Salesforce implementation, a lot of this is likely set up already. The name and address, who's the primary contact, the default locale. So locale, what's your locale settings? I get one default locale and one currency locale at the corporate level. So your locale settings impact how things work or how things are seen in Salesforce. So here in AMER, I know this webinar is on Pacific time zone. I'm in Central time zone. So I might say, we'll come back from a break at 1:30 Central. I'll give you a real time when we get to the break. But in different countries, instead of 1:30, what might you say? 1330. So those are things impacted by your locale. You get one default locale at the corporate level, and then different users can have different locale settings depending on where they're based. Same thing with currencies. Even if you work in a multi-currency org, you get one default currency at the corporate level. Under company information, you can see storage used, file storage, data storage, and this is where you can track your licenses. So it will show you how many licenses you have overall, how many are currently being used, and how many are still available. So the company settings, that's the portion that's under company information. For financial information, you can set the fiscal year. And this impacts things like reporting, like forecasting. We'll see your different fiscal year options in just a minute. And if you work with multiple currencies, you can configure those additional currencies here as well. For support information, this is more common in the service world. We can define business hours, which are really just describing the hours of the day that we expect our support agents to be working on cases. Maybe it's 24 hours a day, maybe it's 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. That's what we define with our business hours. And you can have different business hours covering different regions, covering different tiers of customer. You don't have to set just one set of business hours. With business hours, you can also define holidays. And holidays would be exceptions to those business hours, times when those business hours wouldn't apply. So in AMER, we had holidays last week. I didn't work last Thursday and Friday because we had a holiday in AMER. That would be an exception. We would say we're not expecting our support agents to work on Thanksgiving since that's a holiday. That's an exception to those business hours. One of the things that we track on your company information under company settings are user licenses. And you don't necessarily need to memorize all the different types of user licenses, but it is helpful to be familiar that there are different tiers of user licenses available. So often it's the case, and this is the case with my training org, that most users have this full kind of regular Salesforce license, gives them access to a lot of functionality, a lot of features in Salesforce, although there are still some additional features that require what we call a feature license to add on additional functionality. Then we can give a Lightning platform. So there's a license called Lightning Platform 1 app, and that gives users access to only one app that they would access through the app launcher. We also have some chatter type licenses, and these top two are bolded, chatter free and chatter external. So chatter external is for people who are outside of your company. You can invite them to join you on Chatter, and they can be part of private chatter groups. Only private chatter groups, really limited access. They're not accessing data, very limited in what they can do, but they can join you to collaborate in a private chatter group. Chatter free is for people who are internal to your org, and they would join you just on Chatter. So they don't have access to any data. They can't see any objects or records of those objects, but they do have access to all things Chatter, Chatter free. And both of these licenses come free with your Salesforce orgs. These are not paid licenses, excuse me. These are options for people to join you on Chatter. Then we have our Chatter only license. And this is also sometimes referred to as Chatter Plus. And I like remembering that name because for Chatter only or Chatter Plus, I think Chatter Plus, a few other things like up to 10 custom objects and read permission on accounts and contacts. And then if we look at our third column, we see our Experience Cloud licenses. So Experience Cloud allows us to create those branded sites for customers, for employees, for partners. And it used to be called Community Cloud. Of all the Salesforce name changes, this has been one of the harder ones for me to get on board with or to be consistent with the new naming. And for Experience Cloud users, you will actually still see some licenses that have community in the title. So things like Customer Community Plus, depending on what users of this experience site need to access. They might need access to certain objects or the ability to work with reports and dashboards. A few other that we see listed here, External Apps is also for community, and External Identity is for identity services like single sign-on, which we'll see on a slide later, and passwordless login, or channel account if you have business-to-business sites. So again, I would be less focused on memorizing all of these licenses, but know that some licenses other than kind of our full typical Salesforce license, are going to give people limited access. And some of these, the cost is free, like Chatter External and Chatter Free, or some of these, the cost is going to be lower than a regular Salesforce license. We saw this earlier, coming back to the fiscal year. So this is one of the things that we can set under company settings, the fiscal year. And we have two general options for the fiscal year. Do we want a standard fiscal year or do we want a custom fiscal year? And some important terms to define here. So when we have the word standard in front of something in Salesforce, it means that Salesforce gave it to us out of the box. And it also means in general, we are limited in what we can do with it if it's standard. Custom means it's something that we create ourselves, and in general, we get more control over something custom. The degree to which we get to modify something that's standard, it depends on what it is. But as a general rule, if it's standard, I can't delete it, and I'm limited in some way in what I can do with it. So when would we use a standard fiscal year? A standard fiscal year is probably what you think of more as a traditional fiscal calendar. It has 12 months, there are 4 quarters, there's 3 months per quarter. You might think of it as running from January to December, but it doesn't have to. As long as it starts on the first day of the month, it can start on any month. So on the left-hand side of my slide, what we see here is a screenshot showing me the two options of what we can configure for a standard fiscal year. We can choose the start month of the fiscal year, and then we can choose the second option. It says fiscal year based on the ending month or based on the starting month. So first question, when does the fiscal year start? Does it start in January, February, March? Second question, where it says fiscal year is based on, this has to do with the naming of the fiscal year. So how do we name it? Well, let's look at the example from the screenshot. In this example, the fiscal year starts in February. So that would mean it runs from February 1st, we'll say of 2022, through January 31st of 2023. So that's the month that it starts on, February. And if it's standard, it has to start on the first of the month. The second question says, okay, what is it based on? And if we have it based on the ending month, it looks at the year of the ending month and it calls this FY23. So the ending month ends in the year 2023. I realized I should be in the next year, FY24, behind on my dates. So FY23, the ending month, if we say it's based on the starting month, then we would call this instead FY22. So this just has to do with how we name the fiscal year. Are we going to name it based on the year of the starting month or name it based on the year of the ending month? Well, if it's a fiscal year that runs January to December, guess what? Doesn't matter what I answer for the second question. Both January and December fall in the same calendar year, so the fiscal year would be named the same. So for the standard fiscal year, two questions. What month does it start on? How do we name it? Do we name it based on the starting month or name it based on the ending month? Now, on the right-hand side, we see some scenarios in which I would need a custom fiscal year. And there's a little flag with an important reminder. Once we turn on fiscal years or custom fiscal years, it's a one-way trip. Can't go back. So if you need custom fiscal years, go ahead and turn them on, but don't turn them on just for fun because you're curious and you want to see what it does. You can do that in a Trailhead Playground. Once we turn it on, we cannot disable this feature. When do we need a custom fiscal year? Well, if you have a 13-month fiscal year, so it's kind of like a rolling fiscal year, that would be custom. If we have fiscal quarters that are 13 weeks instead of 3 months, that would be custom. for a fiscal year that starts on any day other than the first of the month, that should be a flag to you that that is not a standard fiscal year. Standard fiscal years have to start on the first day of the month. Sandboxes. We're not spending a lot of time in sandboxes, but this is important for just understanding general best practices for configuration. So if you do configurations in your org, hopefully you're making those configuration changes in a sandbox. A sandbox is a separate but related environment to your live production environment where your users work and where your data lives and where you perform a lot of your regular Salesforce operations. So a sandbox is a replica. It's a copy of at least the metadata from production, and it is a safe place to make your configuration changes, to test those changes, to train your users without hurting production. And when I say a copy of the metadata from production, I mean your configurations, your flows, your page layouts, your custom objects. Those are examples of your metadata. So what we see in this image, my sandbox, my separate environment, this is where I configure my changes. And once I've configured them, once I've tested them, I can send them off to production by deploying them. Deploy them to production so I don't have to go back through all of those steps again. When I want to update my sandbox, I can refresh it. And that takes the current state of affairs in production, at least of the metadata, depending on the sandbox type, could be the data as well, takes the current state of affairs from production and it pushes that to the sandbox. So it gets any updates that are in production that I might not have in my particular sandbox. In general, what do you want to take away from sandboxes? This is where you configure, you test, you can make mistakes, you can try things out without hurting something in production. Now, the number of sandboxes you get, the different types of sandboxes, the size of those, whether they include data, that's going to depend on your edition of Salesforce. Do you have a professional edition? Do you have unlimited enterprise? Those are examples of Salesforce editions. More can be purchased if needed. And we might have that organized differently depending on who's working in those sandboxes. So maybe each developer or each admin has a sandbox and then you push to a shared one before going off to production. One thing that we sometimes recommend or sometimes might do is using the setup audit trail to track setup changes. And these could be done in a sandbox or production. Again, new configurations, those major changes should be done in the sandbox, but the setup audit trail tracks those metadata changes and we can download it for the last 180 days. So good kind of auditing record of what has been changed. I recommend downloading that periodically so if we have a pretty good history to refer back to in the event that we're trying to investigate when a change happened. Here's Rose again, our CEO. She said the Cloud Kicks teams need to be brought into our Salesforce org. But before we set them up, can we review our current security model, make sure it's up to date? So security is known to be a tricky concept in Salesforce, and it is a pretty significant portion of the admin exam. Those who are planning to go on to things like the advanced admin exam, the platform app builder, very significant portion of those exams as well. And I think rightfully so. Security tends to be something that we work with regularly from the beginning of our admin journey to later on in our admin journey, depending on your org. But most orgs have some kind of security features in place. Now, some of you may have heard of these different layers of security, may have heard it used with kind of a building analogy. But if you haven't, let me take a minute to describe it to you. The organization, so your org that people log into, that represents a building itself. So the outermost layer we see depicted on the slide is the organization, and that represents a building. I like to think of this building because there tends to be more security in the office building rather than security in my home where I'm leading this delivery from. So the organization is the building itself. Within that building, there are different floors. And when I go teach at our Salesforce office in San Francisco, I haven't tried my badge on every floor, but I would guess my badge doesn't get me onto every floor. Within your organization, the floors are represented with objects, or objects represent floors, however you choose to say that. Different objects in your organization. But we use this building analogy because I need to get access to the building first before I can get access to floors in the building. I need access to the organization first before I can get access to objects in that organization. Within one of those floors, if I were to walk around, I would see different rooms on the floor. And those rooms are our records within an object. And I will say this is probably where we see the most confusion between object and record access. But I want you to think about the building analogy. If you work at an office and I don't work there, but you say, I'd like to have a meeting and I've reserved a conference room for us to meet in, and you say, meet me in this room, and I get to your office, I can get into the building, but my guest badge does not allow me onto that floor. Doesn't matter that you're going to say, oh yeah, I've got this room reserved. I need to get onto the floor first before I can get into that conference room. So what I want you to think about, and we'll go back to this, is you always need the object level access first before you can get to the record level access. I always need access to the floor before I can get to rooms on the floor. And if I were to walk around on a floor in the Salesforce tower that I have access to, there are different levels of access to rooms. Usually I'm assigned a room where I teach. So for the purposes of my training that week, that is my room. I have full access to that room. I can move stuff around. I can do what I want to. Potentially, I could control access for others. Other rooms that I can maybe see into, but not move stuff around. So we have these offices that have these big glass walls, and I can see what's going on, but maybe not move stuff around. And other rooms that I may not even be aware that they exist. Maybe there's a storage closet somewhere and it's locked and it's shut and there's no window. I have no access to it at all. Just like your users have different levels of access to records in Salesforce. And then if we look at our innermost layer, inside one of those rooms might be a locked drawer or a locked cabinet of some sort. That represents a specific field or different fields on the record itself. And I take the time for this building analogy as a reminder that you always need access to the outer layers before you can get access to the inner layers. We're going to break down some of these different concepts and how we control access in just a moment. But let's talk about them very high level. For the organization itself, there's something called trusted IP ranges. And this was more relevant before we had MFA or multi-factor authentication. In fact, what I would add here, and I'm going to add it with an asterisk because I think it's important, as my own thing to note for logging into the organization is MFA or multi-factor authentication. MFA, multi-factor authentication, is going to be now one of the main ways that people log into the organization. Pre-MFA, there is a different process called identity verification where you had to activate a new device, send you a code, you activate it. Pre-MFA, if you set a trusted IP range, that was setting a global permissive setting that allowed people to log in more easily and they could bypass the identity verification. But now with MFA or multi-factor authentication, people have to go through that strong form of verification every time. And by strong form of verification, I mean getting a code sent to their mobile app or using a physical UB key that they plug into their computer. So that's one option to be aware of. We'll go back to multi-factor authentication in a moment. Other ways that we can control access to the org itself are by limiting or restricting access. I'm going to do a red X for these with login hours and login IP ranges. So on a user's profile, we have the ability to set login hours and say you can only log in from this time to this time. And if you're outside of those hours, you don't go through an extra step. You just cannot log into the org. Same thing with IP ranges. You must log in from within this IP range. And if you're outside of that range, you are unable to log into the org. So that's controlling access to the org itself. Again, I would say potentially it's login hours, login IP ranges. Definitely it's multi-factor authentication. For object access, like we saw on the license slide earlier, it is somewhat controlled by the license that I give you. If I give you a chatter-free license, that doesn't give you access to any objects. So yes, that partially controls your object access. But your object access is primarily controlled by what we call CRED permissions or object permissions. CRED stands for create, read, edit, and delete. Those are your different object permissions. And you may have also referred to this or heard it referred to as CRUD, create, read, update, delete, same kind of permissions that we're working with. These object permissions are set on profiles, permission sets, and potentially given access to via permission set group. And here's how I remember that. In the alphabet, O and P are next to each other. So if you're going through your list of letters alphabetically, it goes O, then P. Object access controlled by the three things that start with P. Profiles, permission sets, and permission set groups, OP. Now, if you've been keeping up with Salesforce updates, Salesforce releases, you're probably aware that we are moving away from managing permissions on the profile and instead managing them with permission sets and permission set groups. So that is coming in 2026. I can never remember if it's spring or summer. Coming in 2026, moving away from permissions on profiles. But currently, profiles still control object permissions. And we'll see a slide on them in just a little bit. Record access is where it gets a little bit more complex because it is less straightforward as far as what controls the record access, meaning there are a number of different ways that I can control that access. OWD stands for organization-wide defaults. So OWD, organization-wide defaults. This is the base level of access that people have to records owned by others. That's our baseline. We can open up access upward through the hierarchy. We can share in different directions through sharing rules. We can share the most flexibly with teams and manual sharing. And for certain objects, I'm going to do an asterisk for this one as well. For certain objects, we can also define restriction rules, which can actually take away a portion of record access that has already been granted. Limited number of objects. And I can't remember if we have a slide on restriction rules, so I'll go ahead and list them here. You can use this for contracts with an R tied to the account. You can use them for tasks and events, custom objects, and external objects. Only objects that allow restriction rules to take away a portion of the access that was previously given. So limited objects, but can be used to control record access. Then if we look at our innermost layer, we have our field level security. And I know page layout is listed here as something that controls field level security, but really it's just part of it. Page layout controls whether people can see it on the layout. What really controls access to a field is field level security. Who can see the field? Who can edit the field? That is what it controls. So let's go into these features a little bit deeper. going back to controlling access to the org itself and kind of looking at your overall security. I mentioned MFA, or multi-factor authentication. MFA combines something that a user knows, their username and password, and something that they have, which could be an authenticator app, or again, it could be that physical YubiKey that they plug into their computer. My favorite example, one that we commonly use, is getting money from the bank. It's a combination of your PIN that you know and your card, your bank card that you have. Unlike identity verification that I mentioned on the last slide, MFA requires users to supply a strong form of verification every time they log in. So it has to be an authenticator app, or it has to be that YubiKey. So you're not going to get a code sent to your email. It has to be a strong factor every time. Then if we look to the right of that, we have a box describing SSO, or single sign-on. And with single sign-on, users can access multiple apps with just one login and one set of credentials. It uses an identity provider to authenticate users and a service provider that trusts the identity provider for authentication. Now, with single sign-on, if you have MFA through your single sign-on provider, that satisfies the MFA requirement. So really what we mean here with MFA is, for the requirement, you have to have either MFA through a direct Salesforce login or MFA through the single sign-on provider. So some way you're logging into Salesforce, you need to go through multi-factor authentication. Then if we look in the bottom left, we have our description for my domain. My domain is your specific branded URL. nto.my.salesforce.com would be NTO's example. Helps you highlight your identity. You can brand your login page. And with my domain, you have the option to allow users to log in using social. My domain is required in a number of other scenarios. So if you're using single sign-on, if you have custom Lightning components and Lightning components tabs, you will need that my domain. And then last, in the bottom right, we have a couple bullet points on the health check. Health check is something that we can go run in our orgs, and it runs through your security settings and compares them to what we believe is ideal at Salesforce. And then it's going to spit out a score. So in this screenshot, the score it gave us is 79%. It says it's good. You do want to be over 70% in your health check. A higher score is going to be better, because it means you're more closely aligned with Salesforce's recommendations for your security settings. And then once it gives you that score, it also gives you a list of items that it's going to recommend that you modify. Some of them, it might say, these are critical changes. We really want you to change this for security. Or some of them, it will say, hey, this is like a warning. Maybe you should consider changing the number of failed attempts that people get before they get locked out of the system, that you can edit in password policies. Maybe you want to change your session settings to time out more quickly, something like that. And then from the list of items, you can click out to go to the place and setup where you can actually make that modification. So Health Check runs through your security settings, compares them to what we believe is ideal, and gives you a score. Here's Rose, our CEO again, and she has another request. We have some different processes for logging in. What parameters are in place to keep data in our org safe? So this is going back to some of those features that we saw on the beginning slide, the one where I did the building analogy. One thing that we can currently use to control security is working with profiles. Very high level, profiles control what users can see and what they can do, what they can see and do. And out of the box, of course, we get standard profiles. We're pretty limited in what we can do with standard profiles. Can't delete them, nor can we edit any standard object permissions or standard system permissions. So there are small things we can do to modify them, but usually not enough to make them really work for us. Previously, in the past, we recommended that you start with a standard profile, you clone it, and then you create a custom profile from there. And you may still do this, but I would say in a more limited capacity. And I apologize that the images are cutting off the text here. I'll give you the important bullet points from this slide. Custom profiles, simply ones that we create, we can modify those further as we need to. But again, coming in the future, we are moving away from permissions on profiles and managing them instead with permission sets. And then you can use permission set groups. We'll see those on a slide in a minute. Even when we move away from this, there are a handful of things that will still be managed on the profile. Things like login hours, login IP ranges, default apps, default record types. Those will continue to be managed on profiles even in the future. So what you want to be thinking about now is, what can I give someone with a profile that's more limited access? Users still will have profiles, but really will rely a lot on permission sets and permission set groups to really control the access that they have. Now, sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. A profile versus a user record. And these are two separate features in Salesforce. Profile is kind of like the set of abilities, controlling what a user can see and what they can do. Every individual user in Salesforce is tracked and has their own user record. So what is set where? On the left-hand side of the slide, we see the items that are controlled by your profile. Apps that you have access to when you open the app launcher. Tabs that you can see. Which ones are across the top of my page versus which ones do I have to go to the app launcher to access? Object permissions are a big one. Field level security. Login hours, login IP ranges are some examples of things that are controlled by the profile. On the right-hand side, we see the list of things that are controlled on the user record. So this is basic user information, the user's name, their email address, their username. What do you need to remember about the username? When you create a user and you set their username, it must be in the format of an email address, and it must be unique in the whole world of Salesforce. Meaning if I create you as a user today, your username can't have been used in any user, in any other Salesforce org, anywhere ever. Has to be unique in the whole world of Salesforce. So it doesn't actually have to be a real email address. It just has to follow the format of one. In my org, we have a consistent naming convention for our usernames. It's not a real email address. We always adhere to that specific naming convention. Then it adds consistency for when we're working with those usernames. And I didn't mention this in my intro, but currently in my non-teaching time, I also work as an admin of an org that's used to manage our whole instructor community. So full-time instructors who work for Salesforce like I do, and then also instructors who are contractors who deliver our training on our behalf. Every user needs a user license. And we saw that earlier, some different license options. The license I select will determine the available profiles that I can choose from. Every user can have a role, I should say. So role will show up as a required field. You'll see the red bar next to role, but none specified satisfies the requirement for a user's role. So we can choose to not have a role. In general, if we're using roles for security, which we often do, it would be a good practice to make sure every user does have one, but maybe you're creating users and assigning them a role later, so you could say none specified. On the user record, we'll also see some checkboxes on the right-hand side, and those are allowing us to give different feature licenses. In fact, let me just show you the last few items in the org. So feature licenses, locale settings, and login history. Again, orgs are not provided as part of this training, but I did have a training org that I was logged into earlier that will kind of give you a visual of some of these features. So let me go back and log into my training org so I can show you what the slide is referring to for the different user features. You could probably follow through a similar click path if you have a Trailhead Playground or a developer org, something like that. But this is just one of my extra training orgs I've used. If I were to go to a list of users, and I've got some fictitious users in my org. One of them is Rose, the CEO who keeps popping up on the slides. And I click on one of these users. We'll see those different things that we can set from the list of things controlled on the user record. And one of the items are feature licenses. And that's what we see here on the right-hand side of the slide. For example, giving someone a marketing user feature license gives them the ability to work with campaigns, create, edit, delete campaigns, different feature licenses that you can select, or even the ability to work with screen flows, which I could give with the flow user. And that one I don't think I would consider a feature license specifically, but give someone additional ability. So that's where we set their feature licenses. On the user record, we can also see their locale settings. So English US is the locale. I can see their language. I can see their time zone. And then if I look, I won't see any history here since this isn't a real user. But near the bottom of the user record, I can view their login history. And this is something very important for helping troubleshoot when users are logging in, if they need help logging into the system. If I have a user who reaches out to me and they need help, first thing I'll do is go look at their login history. Did they lock themselves out of the system? Did they have an incorrect password? Were they trying to log in outside of their login hours? So all of that would be on the user record. Let's talk about working with permissions. So again, profiles are still there. Currently, they're still probably setting the base level of access that users have. So setting what they can see and do as kind of a template that gets applied to a lot of people. But in reality, and definitely moving forward, we're going to rely more on permission sets and permission set groups to tailor and give additional functional access. So a permission set is used to grant additional functional access beyond what the user already has with their profile. There are a few thousand of us on the call, a lot for the webinars. I'm glad to see y'all are excited for Cert Day webinars to come back. And maybe most of us on the call need the same abilities in the system, but some of us on the call whose name starts with C, you all need additional abilities. You need the ability to delete opportunities. And those of you whose name starts with the letter D, you need the ability to export reports. So I can create permission sets to grant additional functionality beyond what you already have and assign those to more specific people. Not everyone needs to see and do the same thing, even within the same profile. So this allows me to tailor additional access. Permission sets by themselves are only additive. They are giving that additional access. We do have a way to take away, but that's only within a only within a permission set group. Muting permission set is what that's called, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, as we are moving away from managing permissions on profiles and managing more with permission sets, we might find ourselves every time we create a new user assigning this permission set and this one and this one and this one and this one. Every time someone requests a new user in the org, I usually ask them, I say, okay, whose access should I mirror? Whose access should they have the same access as? And then I go look at that person and I see the permission sets that they have, and those are the ones that I assign. And lately, I find myself assigning quite a few permission sets to most of the new users I create. So what we can do to make that assignment process a little bit easier is group those permission sets together in what we call a permission set group. It's bundling various permission sets together if they are often assigned hand in hand. Now, this doesn't take away the flexibility of the individual permission sets. Those are there. I can still do it kind of piecemeal with the individual ones, but I can also bundle them together in a group and assign that one permission set group instead of all of those individual permission sets. So in the future, it very well could be the case that you are using permission set groups to put permissions together based on job functions or tasks to be completed. Here we see an example of an HR super user permission set group. Excuse me. And in this permission set group, we have one permission set for the HR objects, another one for reports and dashboards, another one that makes them a super user. So we have various permission sets together, bundled together to help support their tasks to be done or their job function. Now, within a permission set group, I might decide that I want to take away some of the access given by a portion of that permission within one of the permission sets in the group. Let me explain what I mean by that. So let's look at this example in the bottom right. It lists permissions in the HR intern permission set group. And let's say in this permission set group, they have create, read, edit, delete on HR objects. And they have the ability to create report folders and the ability to export reports. And for the intern, maybe I'm good with them having most of these permissions. Let me break these down too. So these are part of two separate permission sets. One for the HR objects, one is reports and dashboards. Two permission sets in the group. And I think of this permission set group kind of like a list of abilities that I'm going to give to this HR intern. So I'm going to give you the ability to do these things with HR objects, to create report folders, to export reports. But before I give you this list of things to do, I realize, you know what? I'm not comfortable with you deleting my objects. So I want to simply cross one thing off the list. I want to cross delete off the list. But delete is not a separate permission set, so I can't just remove it from the group. I am taking away a subset of an ability within a single permission set. To do that, I can use a muting permission set. And it only takes that access away within the context of this permission set group. And it only mutes it for the person who has this permission set group assigned or the people who have the permission set group assigned. If someone else has the permission set for HR objects by itself, they still get delete. If someone else has it as part of another permission set group, they still get it. Muting just takes it away within the context of that specific permission set group. Now, similarly, I could, there we go. I could also say, well, I'm going to get rid of delete, and I also don't want you exporting reports. You only get one muting permission set in a permission set group, but you can mute multiple abilities within that one muting permission set. I know that was a lot of detail, but let me sum it up. Permission sets are going to give you add additional functional access, so kind of a plus sign for permission sets. Groups simply allow you to bundle permission sets together based on a job function. So could be replacing what we previously managed with profiles, now doing it with a permission set group. Muting permissions are used to subtract. They are used to take away a permission or multiple permissions that are part of a permission set group. You can only add them within a permission set group. Okay, that takes care of our object level access. The next thing we're looking at, and I know we skipped over record, we'll come back to record access. The next thing that we're looking at is field level security. Field level security is relatively straightforward. It controls two things. So we can ask two questions. Who can see a field? Who can edit a field? That's what field level security controls. Do I want accounts receivable to see it and edit it? Do I want my technical marketer to see it or edit it? Who can see it? Who can edit it? That's all it controls. Field level security can be set on your profile, can also be set on permission sets. And you can turn on a setting in setup that allows you to set field level security from the field wizard through permission sets now instead of profiles. Again, moving away from those permissions on profiles. Field level security controls a user's total access to the field. And I think maybe some new admins might think, well, if I don't want my technical marketers to see this field, I'll just remove it from the page layout. Well, they wouldn't see it on the page layout, so that part is good. But they might see it other places. They might see it on a related list. They might find it in search results, on a report, in a list view. So if I really don't want them to have access to the field, then I can take that access away via field level security. So I can say, nope, they can't see it. They can't edit it. And if that's the case for that profile, that field doesn't exist. If I take away access through field level security, they will not be able to find it anywhere. Unless they're an admin, they can find it in setup. Even for admins, if we don't make it visible for ourselves, we won't find it anywhere outside of the object manager. So total control to the field. Who can see it? Who can edit? Now, we saved the most complex piece of security for last. Default record access. And then we'll talk about record access to records that users don't own. So when we talk about record access, our rooms within those floors, it's helpful to think of records in kind of two categories: records that users own and records that they don't own. When a user owns a record, they get special ownership privileges. We sometimes call this full access. We sometimes call this vested, V-E-S-T-D, so no second E in vested. And these are special abilities that the owner gets to records that they own. There are also some kind of bonus vested privileges that I'll mention in a minute. So when we say someone is vested, that means when they own a record, they can see it, they can view it, they can edit it, they can share it with someone else. I want to give you access to a record that I own, give you the ability to see and edit it. They can transfer it. I don't want to own this account anymore. I'm going to make you the owner of the account. And they can delete it. They have the ability to click delete, sends the record to the recycle bin. The two bonus privileges are the ability to change the record type and the ability to edit opportunity splits. We'll see this on a later slide. So kind of bonus ownership privileges, change the record type, and edit opportunity splits. Now on the slide is a very important disclaimer. And I want you to have this disclaimer in the back of your head, not just for record ownership. Anytime you are talking about record access, this is the little asterisk, this disclaimer I want you to have in the back of your head. Given that they have the right profile and permission set permissions first. Meaning, if this person we're looking at on the slide is Alima, and Alima owns All About Camping, but her profile does not give her delete on accounts, Alima cannot delete All About Camping. So they need the right permissions through their profile or permission set first. And that applies to ownership. That applies to anything we talk about with record access. They will not be able to do more than what their profile and permission sets allow. It is also helpful to kind of understand the different levels of record access that I might choose to grant. And we see this here, it looks like, different layers of a circle. The innermost layer would be read-only. They can view it. So that would be like one of the rooms. I can walk around on the floor. I can see what's going on, but Maybe someone else is delivering a different training. I can't go in and move stuff around while they are working in that room. A level up from there is edit, read and write. Maybe someone says, hey, can you come help me set up this room for a meeting I have? They're allowing me to come in, I can see things, I can move it around. Top level of access, full access. Again, this is another way of defining vested. They can view, they can edit, they can share, they can transfer, which is changing ownership. They can delete, they can change the record type. There's that bonus. And later we'll talk about opportunity splits as well, ability to edit splits. So think of these different levels of record access. Could be that they have no access to records. Could be some of your records contain really sensitive information. They wouldn't be able to see them. Or they might have one of these levels. When we get into our different tools for giving record access, lots of options for giving read access, lots of options for giving read write, not as many options for giving full access. It is harder to get to the ownership level of access. It is easier to give read only and read write. Here we see all of the different ways we can control that record access. So records that you own, you get the vested access. View, edit, share, transfer, delete, provided you have the right profile and permission set abilities first. What this slide is describing is access to records that users don't own. And here's where we see a number of different features. And we have this depicted in kind of a triangle, or some people call it a pyramid. I think it's more like a triangle, our record access triangle. The first thing we do is set our organization-wide defaults. So OWDs, organization-wide defaults, whatever you call them. That is the base level of access that users have to records owned by other people. And you'll notice it says you can restrict access here. For most of our objects, this is your option to restrict. Again, restriction rules work for a very limited handful of objects, but for most of your standard objects, accounts, opportunities, cases, contacts, leads, so on, if I want to restrict access, I have to do it with the org-wide defaults. Because all of these other ones, it says they open access up. Open up access, role hierarchy, sharing roles, teams, manual sharing, those open up access. Org-wide defaults are my option to restrict if I need to. So there are different ways I can set these. I can set it to private, which means as a baseline, you can only see and edit your own records. I can set it to public read only, which means as a baseline, I can see records owned by others, only edit my own. Or I can set it to public read write. And I've heard of this option referred to as the Wild West. You can see and edit anyone's records, doesn't matter who owns them. But of course, we still have the disclaimer, provided users have the right permissions on their profile and permission set first. So how I set these is going to depend on the sensitivity of the data in the object, because I can set this for every object in my org. And it's also going to depend on the user working with that object. My org-wide defaults in my org are found under my sharing settings. And you may have this instinct as well that you want to quick find org-wide defaults. They're actually found under your sharing settings. So we can see in my NTO here, NTO org, some are set to public read only, others are set to private. And ones that are set to private were probably set in this way because I have users of this object, say of the case object, who maybe should see some cases, but shouldn't see all the cases. If they're set to public read only and you have object access to my contacts, then you can see every contact in the system. Doesn't matter who owns it. So when do we set to private? You might have heard people say, well, if there's one user who shouldn't see it, you have to set it to private. I would say almost to that. I would say that's close, but it's not quite that simple. When do I set my org-wide defaults to private? If you have one user of that object who should see some records within that object but shouldn't see all of them, that's when I set my org-wide defaults to private. And I say of that object because it could be the case that you have a custom object and only certain people see it. And if you have some people who should never see it, then they just don't have the object access to it. So if you have a user of an object and they should see some opportunities, but they shouldn't see all of them, that's when we set it to private. So think about user of that object. Now, once we set our baseline with the org-wide defaults, we can choose to open it up from there. The role hierarchy opens up access in one direction and one direction only, and that is upward through the hierarchy, which means people who are above others in the role hierarchy inherit the same level of access as people below them. Again, provided they have the right permissions already. So if I look at my role hierarchy and I see CloudKicks, that new company that we're acquiring, a CloudKicks sales rep is kind of the lowest level in this branch of the hierarchy. Whatever access they have rolls up to the person above them or the role above them, the CloudKicks sales manager. Their access rolls up to the role above them, the VP of Global Sales. And it is not just access to view, it is the full vested access. So earlier I mentioned it's harder to get the vested access. Who gets vested? Well, the owner of the record gets it. Someone above them in the hierarchy, they get vested. And someone with modify all data, which would be us, the system admin, or in theory, if I gave that to other people, which we don't do too frequently. So not very many options to get to that full or vested level of access. How else can we give access? Well, maybe we want to share in different directions. And it does say that sharing rules are lateral. They can be. Sharing rules can really share in any direction, provided the records that I'm sharing have something in common with one another. So for a sharing rule, in order to use one, what I need to think about is, what do the records have in common? They can have ownership in common, all records owned by U.S. sales reps. Well, it would have to be by object, all opportunities owned by U.S. sales reps. Or they can have criteria in common, all accounts in the retail industry, all leads whose lead source is trade show, but they do need something in common if I'm going to share them with sharing rules. Now, if none of these options work to give the right access so far, the next couple things I can turn to are teams and manual sharing. These are the most flexible, but also can be the most manual. There are 3 objects in Salesforce that allow teams, and those are accounts, cases, and opportunities. And we remember this with Taco. I got that from a fellow instructor. Teams, accounts, cases, opportunities. 3 objects that allow teams. So if we are working together on an account and I want you to have additional access to that account, I can add you to the account team. I can give additional access, and we have a nice, easy way of tracking that. The last and final option that I would consider is manual sharing. I am going to manually share a lead record with you. Manual sharing is nice if we need to turn to it. However, if record ownership is changed, so I'm the owner of a lead, I share it with you, and then I transfer the lead to someone else. Guess what happens to manual sharing? It's gone. It goes away. So if ownership is transferred, manual sharing goes away. So it's not that we don't use it, but I like to evaluate my other options first before we turn to manual sharing. Now, what you can do is have a flow that manually shares. So you can kind of automate it based on conditions, or you can do it manually with the sharing button on the record. So all of these are ways to control access to records that users don't own. The only way listed on this particular slide that restricts access is by setting the org-wide defaults. That is the bulk of security. We'll see a quick scenario on security in just a moment. Yeah, let's see if we can get through this lesson, and then we'll take our first break today. Really quick detour, kind of related to security, and that is discussing delegated administration. So many of you may be the system admin in your org, and maybe there are more routine tasks that you perform over and over again that you feel like someone else trusted in your org could help with. Delegated administration is in two different categories: the ability to manage users and/or the ability to manage custom objects. So if you make someone a delegated admin to have them help manage users, then they can do things like logging in as users, resetting their passwords, unlocking them if they get locked out, assigning them to profiles and permission sets that we allow, and even creating and managing public groups. Public groups are used to group users together who aren't kind of otherwise related. You can use them for sharing, you can use them for defining who to send an email to. So public groups group people together. When I make someone a delegated admin, I'm not necessarily, unless I choose to, making them a delegated admin for all users. But we have a delegated admin I set up in my org. When we brought the Tableau training team into Trailhead Academy, she's kind of our operations manager for Tableau instructors. And I said, you can be the delegated admin for Tableau users. You can reset their password. You can unlock them if they get locked out. You can create new users. You can assign permission sets that we specify, not for all the users, but for that subset of our users based on the roles that we specify. On the custom object side of things, we can allow users to work in setup and customize objects in setup. Think about what you would do with a custom object. You might add a new field or modify a pick list value or change the page layout or add a record type or a validation rule. Those are the types of things that delegated admins can do for custom objects in setup. We had another user in my org. They said, hey, can you make me an admin so I can create a custom object? But what I did instead was created the custom object for them. I made them a delegated admin of that object. And then I said, well, you can run with it from here. You can add your fields. You can change your page layout. If you want to change to it, then you can manage it from there. But really just two categories: ability to manage users and manage custom objects. What other user management tools should you know about? I mentioned I'm going to start in the bottom right, which lists my password policies, and I'll work my way around. This was not listed before, but this falls under that org access. If you're logging in with a password to Salesforce, and we do for the org I'm an admin of, we have a username and password that we use for our login. So we can set these password policies at the org level. We can also set them to be more restrictive on the profile. It controls things like how many passwords are remembered, what's the minimum length for a password, how many failed attempts do I get at entering my password before I get locked out of the system. So this can be an important security piece. This is one of those things that may come up on your setup audit trail as something to adjust from a security perspective. If I look on the right, I see the option to log in as a user. This depends on a setting in your org. There's a setting that says, can admins log in as any user? Meaning you can log in and impersonate your different users, and they don't have to explicitly grant you access to do so. I would say the vast majority of orgs have this ability, but some don't if they're higher on security. Logging in as a user is especially what I do if I'm testing, if I'm trying to replicate an error that they experience. I can log in as them and see what they're doing, see what they have the ability to edit, maybe replicate that error. If I move to the top left, I have the ability to freeze my users. So when we have a user and we don't want logging into the system, there are two ways that we can prevent them from logging in. One way is to freeze them. That's supposed to be a number one. The second way would be to deactivate a user. When do we choose one or the other? Well, freeze is meant to be a little bit more temporary. Maybe someone's out on an extended leave, or maybe someone left the company, but they happen to be the default workflow user or the default case owner. I might freeze them first, shuffle things around in setup, and then go back and deactivate them. So freeze is meant to be temporary. It prevents them from logging in, but what it does not do is free up their license. So freeze prevents login. It doesn't free up a license. Deactivating, deselecting the active checkbox on the user, frees up a license, and it still prevents them from logging in. Now, they can still be reactivated, but some of their sharing would have gone away if I deactivated the user. Freeze is more temporary. Deselecting active actually frees up that license. Now, I know everyone is in listen only mode, so see if you can just answer kind of where you are for these requirements, and then we will go through them together. And then, nope, there's a lot of animation. I can't progress from there. And then I think we'll be at a good point for our first break because we'll be about done with this first lesson. So let's look at these different requirements. First requirement, marketing director manages marketing associates and marketing interns. The director needs to modify and report on all leads and campaigns owned by her team. So everyone think through this for just a minute. What does this sound like to you? What security feature that we just talked about does it sound like would give her the ability to modify and report on all leads and campaigns owned by people who are reporting up to her? Everyone think through it a minute on their own. And if you're thinking, that sounds a lot like the role hierarchy, yeah, do that with a role hierarchy. Allow that access to roll up. And I know the requirement said that we want the director's direct reports. Often the role hierarchy is similar to your HR org chart, but it doesn't have to be. It is built out based on who needs access to data. So role hierarchy, I don't know if we need the associates or interns separately yet. We'll figure that out in a minute. Let's go back to requirement number 2. The marketing director and the marketing associates need to create, view, edit, and delete leads and campaigns. Interns should only view and edit leads and campaigns. So I want you all to start practicing, if you haven't done so already, looking for keywords. And I'm highlighting these here intentionally. What do create, view, edit, delete sound like? Now, view, we might call read. But if I replace view with the word read, hopefully you're thinking, that sounds like object permissions. Where do we set object permissions? Let's go look at the next number. We set object permissions on profiles or permission sets. So this could be profile, permission set. In the future, maybe more of a permission set group. We'll talk in a minute about why we want 2 separate profiles in just a minute. So object permissions, hopefully that's what you're thinking of for requirement number 2. Requirement number 3, interns need to view and edit only leads and campaigns related to specific projects that they are working on. So now, hopefully you're not thinking object permissions. Now you're probably thinking more along the lines of record access. Record access. And what we see here, described in a different way, is a situation where interns are users of this object. They should see some, but not all, leads and campaigns. So if you have a situation where interns should see some, but not all, leads and campaigns, what does that sound like we need to do for record access? What would we do differently for record access if they need to see some, but not all, leads and campaigns? I'm going to get rid of my drawings and go back to our analysis here. I think I went too far forward. So leads and campaigns are set to private. How do we give that access? Well, leads and campaigns don't have teams. Maybe we manually share them, or maybe we find something that those leads and campaigns have in common with one another. Let's go back to the requirements. Here we have requirement number 4. Marketing associates need to see each other's leads and campaigns. Need to see each other's leads and campaigns. So again, we're talking about record access, and it sounds to me like these leads and campaigns have something in common with one another. I need to see leads owned by other marketing associates. That would be another way to word this. So how would they see each other's leads and campaigns? Requirement number 4, we could have a sharing rule. So we could say, share all leads owned by associates with other associates. Share all campaigns owned by associates with other associates. Sharing rule for that one. And let's look at the last 2 together. Number 5, only some marketing associates can transfer leads. Now, I know we talked about transfer as an ownership privilege. Transfer leads is also a permission that you can give on a profile or permission set. So think about that one. And then marketing interns should only log in between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. Sounds like limiting when they can log in based on hours. So let's look at the final round with all the answers filled in. Requirement number 5, we could do a permission set to transfer leads. Not everyone, some people need it. We're using that to flexibly give the access. And then this one here, I don't think I advanced enough. There we go. Number 6, why do we need a separate profile for those intern users? Well, permission sets and permission set groups don't allow us to set login hours. Permission sets and permission set groups are additive. They give additional functional access, and they don't allow us to limit access via login hours. So if we're limiting that access, that still has to be done on the profile. And that still in the future will be done on the profile, even when we're moving to manage permissions with permission sets and permission set groups. Hopefully you were able to kind of play along with that one. We'll see a few other rounds of questions, a few other scenarios in our later lessons. Actually, let's do this one. Then we'll finish this, and then we'll take our first break. I know that's a long lesson, everyone. I promise we'll make up a little bit of time in a little bit. So another round of questions, no little grid of solutions here. Just answer where you are, and I will type in answers as we go. And again, answer in your head or out loud, whatever is easiest for you. Question number 1. A user cannot log into Salesforce. The login history for her user record shows no failed login attempts. What is most likely preventing her from logging in? We didn't talk about this specifically, but think about it. I look at her login history. There's no login attempts at all. No successful, no failed. What's going on? Could be something like maybe she has the wrong username. I've seen that before. The wrong URL. Seen that one before as well. If she's logging in with the correct username, even if she's outside of login hours, outside of IP ranges, she doesn't pass verification, that still shows up as a login attempt. Let's look at number 2. Northern Trail Outfitters uses a private data model for accounts. When sales engineers are working on specific accounts, they need access to the accounts in question, as well as the associated opportunities and cases. The sales engineers do not own these accounts. How could they be granted access? Think about the different ways that we can give access, different ways that we can control record access. What way makes the most sense here? So what I want you to look at in this question, sales engineers are working on specific accounts. We don't know what these specific accounts are. We don't know if they have anything in common with one another. So if there's nothing explicitly in this question that tells us that these records have something in common with one another, sharing rules are out. So what could we do for this one? I mean, we could manually share, but really probably the best option here would be to do teams. And from the account team, I can also control their access to the related opportunities and cases. Question number 3. The VP of Global Sales just left the company to go work for a competitor. What action should we take to prevent the user from logging in and accessing Salesforce data? How do we prevent them from logging in and accessing Salesforce data? 2 answers could be possible here. One option, we could freeze the user. This is just temporary, doesn't free up a license. Ultimately, we want to get to the point where we can deactivate the user. Might have to move some things around. Maybe this user is the running user of a dashboard. We want to transfer that to be someone else, but could freeze, could deactivate. Final question, number 4. What's the difference between trusted IP ranges and login IP ranges? Trusted IP and login. We talked about this only briefly. Trusted IP versus login. Trusted IP is the setting that's global and it's permissive. So I'm just going to add some quick notes here, global and permissive. This one was helpful when we used identity verification in the past. It does not satisfy multi-factor authentication requirements, so not really as relevant now. Login IP ranges are restrictive and they're set at the profile level. So only for certain profiles and can actually restrict access. You can't log in if you're outside of that range. Hopefully you all did well on those questions. And even if you didn't know the answers, use this as practice to think through different questions, different scenarios, and start looking for some key terms. Again, these will be linked on the frequently asked questions. So check out those links if you want to do additional study on these topics. I think we're at a good point for our first break. And let me see. I think we're doing okay on pacing. We're going to have to make up a little bit of time somewhere, but security is an important topic to cover. So let's do this. Let me swap out my deck. Where's my other deck? And we are going to take a quick break. I'm going to draw on the screen, annotate on the screen when we are returning. Let's return in 12 minutes. So we're going to return at 45 minutes after the hour. I believe that is 10:45 Pacific or 45 minutes after the hour. If I can spell Pacific. Everyone take about 12 minutes, take a quick break, and I'll see you back here at 45 minutes after the hour. See you soon.